As we buy newer machines or build newer machines, we're going to be stepping in at some point to the DDR5 realm. And in this video, we're going to be reviewing two different types of DDR5. First off, we're going to be reviewing the Sabrent Rocket DDR5 32GB kit. This kit is 4800 megahertz and also doesn't have an XMP profile. It uses the JEDEC standard. Now, coming in right after that, we're going to be reviewing the Kingston Technology Fury Beast Black 32GB kit, coming in at 5600 megahertz. Now this does have XMP profiles, but actually this might give it a little run for its money, but we'll see that later on in the review. So first off, we're going to go over real quick on how to install it. Now for the RAM, we'll go ahead and match up this little notch right over here, right in the center, with this notch right over here. First off, we need to unlock this over here, which allows us to insert the memory. Depending on how many sticks of RAM you have, you want to install your RAM on DIMM A2 and DIMM B2. Now, if you have 4 sticks of RAM, of course, you would just take up all 4 slots, and this will differ from board to board, so make sure to check out the motherboard manual just in case. For this board, since there isn't that locking mechanism right over here, we're going to go ahead and slide the memory in from the side over here and just push it down. But now you'll notice we installed the memory incorrectly. Notice how the little notches right over here don't line up with that notch. That's okay, we'll just flip it around. And again, because this is DDR5 in a DDR5 board, we'll just slide it in this way. And now we don't need to push this in. Once we push the memory down, it'll go ahead and lock itself. And we've installed one stick. Okay, now with the memory facing correctly, we'll do the same right over here. Just drop it right in place. Now, in the BIOS, things are going to be a little bit different. For the Kingston, since it does have XMP, we go into Advanced Memory, then we go into AI Tweaker. Under AI Overclock Tuner, we'll enable one of the 2 XMP profiles. They're both the same. Then we can see here 5600, 5200, and 4800, and then also their CAS latencies and their voltages. And then we can see there's 3 of them. So that's for the Kingston memory. Now, stepping into the Sabrent memory, we see things just a little bit different. So coming back into the BIOS under the advanced mode, AI Tweaker, and then back into AI Overclock Tuner, we can see there's auto, there's manual, and then there's AEMP. AEMP is actually new and brought on by Asus on their Z690 chipsets. AEMP stands for Asus Extended Memory Profile. So of course it's going to be on Asus motherboards. Now what this does is it boosts DDR5 modules that don't have XMP profiles beyond their official limits by unlocking voltage management on the power management integrated circuit, allowing it to overclock easy, all on the motherboard. So there's nothing you need to do on that. Of course, you can go farther if you manually go in and tweak and tune it, but not all of us are comfortable in doing that. So that's something pretty awesome that Asus does, and I don't know if any other motherboard manufacturers do that. So cool on that. Throughout this video, we're going to be using the 3 Kingston profiles as well as the 2 Sabrent profiles. Now, mind you, one is the JEDEC standard, which comes default on both sticks of RAM, and then there is the AEMP profile that Asus makes, but you can actually go in and edit your own settings on your own motherboard if you don't have an Asus motherboard to match, and it should be around the same. You'll be able to get a lot more than just the base 4800, and it actually works out pretty well in this review. So we're going to be using 3D Mark TimeSpy, IDA 64, CineBench R23, 7-zip, Cyberpunk 2077, F1 2021, Farcry 6, HitMan 3, and then finally for productivity, we're going to be using Wondershare Filmora, the video editing application I use myself. So anyway, let's get started. So starting off with 3D Mark, I'm going to start you off on how the rest of the benchmarks are going to be. And the way we're going to present the benchmarks are a little bit different. We're first going to demonstrate how the 4800 differs between the Sabrent and the Kingston. Then after that, we're going to show the performance differences of the other profiles, since officially the Sabrent doesn't have a secondary profile. So starting off with 3D Mark, we can see on the 4800, the Sabrent fell a little behind. So first off, on the CPU score, the Sabrent fell 0.13% below the Kingston at at 4800 on the CPU. On the graphics score, we can see the Sabrent fell 0.15% below the Kingston, and likewise on the extreme score, it also went down 0.15%. Unfortunately, the standardized JDEC profile didn't do Sabrent any favors, but there's more. Now, after the standardized profile, there is the 5200, the 5600 on the Kingston, and then the 6000 on the Sabrent. But again, the Sabrent is an unofficial profile. So we can see here, even though the 6000 unofficial profile is technically faster with a lower cast latency than the Kingston 4800, 5200, and even 5600, the 4800 bested the 6000. So we can see between the 4800 and the 6000, there's a 0.36% lead in favor of the Kingston, even though it was a slower speed. Then between the 248s, there was a 0.15% lead in favor of the Kingston, but we have enough on that one. Let's dip into 7-zip. So 7-zip, we can see the true power of the Sabrent. So first off, starting with the 4800, between the two 4800, the Sabrent 4800 bests the Kingston 4800 on the compression side by 118,833 mits. On the decompression side, the Sabrent once again bests the Kingston, but by a measly 0.29%. Not even 1%, but every little bit helps. Then after that, the Sabrent 6000 bests the Kingston 5600 by a 0.83% on decompression. And then on compression, the Sabrent again 6000 bests the Kingston 5600 by 5.48%. So that's a pretty nice increase there. So let's move on to IDA 64. So on IDA 64, latency, the lower is the better. We can see here on the Sabrent 4800, the latency is 74.7, while the latency on the Kingston 4800 is 83.0. So there is a 1.75% difference in favor of the Sabrent. Now on the copy side and the rest of these benchmarks here, higher is better. On the copy, we can see again the Sabrent bested the Kingston 4800 by 1.75%, 69,928 over 68,706. We can see the Sabrent came in at 69,916, while the Kingston came in at 69,313, a 0.86% increase in favor of the Sabrent. And finally, on the read speed, the Sabrent came in at 75,515 versus the Kingston at 75,418, a 0.86% difference. Stepping out a little bit further, we can see the Sabrent 6000 came in over the Kingston 5600 on latency by 8.16%. That's pretty impressive. And then on copy, 4.79%. At 83,154 over 78,141. On write, we can see there is a 4.79% increase on the Sabrent side by 82,566 versus 78,611. And on read, 92,615 over 86,813, a 6.25% lead in favor of the Sabrent. Now moving over to CineBench R23, we can see the Sabrent 4800 took the lead over the Kingston 4800 from 27,231 to Kingston's 27,052, a 0.66% lead. Now on the single core, we can see the Sabrent 4800 was 1,935 under the Kingston 4800's 1982, a 2.43% lead on the Kingston side. Now onto the overall, we can see the Sabrent 6000 took the lead, coming in at 27,231 over the Kingston's 5200, which was the second highest, even over the 5600 by 0.91%, and that was on the multi-core. But on the flip side, on the single core, the Kingston 4800 takes the lead over the Sabrent 6000 at 1982 over 1955. That's a 1.38% increase over the Sabrent. The Kingston takes the lead on this one. So the fastest on this one would come in on multi-core on the Sabrent 6000, and then the fastest on single core on the Kingston 4800. So take your pick on that one. Jumping over to games, Cyberpunk 2077. On Cyberpunk 2077, I come into graphics, and I will set this to Ray Tracing Ultra if I'm using RTX, and if I'm not using RTX, I set this to Ultra here. Then I come into video, and then here I either change it to 3840 by 2160 or 1920 by 1080 and just run benchmark. Try to keep it as simple as possible. At 4K with RTX on, comparing the two 4800s, we can see the Sabrent 4800 takes the lead over the Kingston 4800 by 0.61%. A small lead, but a lead's a lead on the max FPS. On the min FPS, the Sabrent again takes the lead, this time by a whopping 22.93%. That's pretty nice. But then on the most important, the average, the Kingston 4800 takes the lead by 0.25%, 111.41 over 111.13. It's not tremendous, but every little bit over helps. And in general, on this benchmark, oddly enough, what takes the lead is the Kingston 5200, even over the Kingston 5600 and the Sabrent 6000. Here we can see the Kingston 5200 came in at 157.25 on the max FPS over the Sabrent's 6000, a 1.12% lead at 155.49. On the flip side, on the minimum, the Sabrent 4800 here takes the lead, coming in at 63.28 over Kingston's 5600 at 61.01 frames per second. Then the Kingston 5600 under average comes in at 111.53 over Sabrent's 6000 at 110.65 frames per second. Now, to me, the Sabrent series takes the lead here because the min FPS here stays above 60 frames per second, whereas we can see here on the Kingston side, it did drop below on both 5200 and 4800 below 60 frames per second. Now, it did come up 1 point ahead on the 5600 on the average frames per second, which is, of course, the most important. But I still feel like the Sabrent 6000 here took the lead. Let me know what you think down below. Now, stepping over to Cyberpunk 2077 4K at Ultra non-RTX, we can see the Kingston 4800 came in at 134.25 frames per second, 0.075% higher than Sabrent's 4800 at 134.15 frames per second, but then the rest on the 4800 flips. We can see the min FPS on the Sabrent 4800 is 63.58 frames per second, while on the Kingston came in at 60.02 frames per second, still over 60 frames per second, so at least that's good. Now on the magic average frames per second, we can see again the Sabrent 4800 took the lead at 88.18 frames per second over the Kingston's 84.06 frames per second. A 4.67% lead in favor of Sabrent. Now, we can see overall, the Sabrent 6000 takes the lead on max FPS at 135.92 frames per second over the second best Kingston 4800 profile, coming in at 134.25, a 1.23% lead in favor of Sabrent. Then here, the Kingston 5600 takes the lead on the min FPS at 66.16 frames per second, coming in second, ahead of the second best Sabrent 4800 at 63.58 frames per second. A 3.92% lead in favor of Kingston. Then on average FPS, we can see the Sabrent 6000 comes in the lead at 88.39 frames per second over the Kingston's 5600 profile, coming in at 85.08. So again, the Sabrent 6000 series here takes the lead using Asus's own profile, not Sabrent's own profile, so that can be considered a little bit of cheating here, but whatever you have, you have. So if you have an Asus board, you might be in luck here. Just make sure you're on the latest BIOS. Now on Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with RTX on Ultra, we can see here the Sabrent 4800 just fell apart here. Overall, the Kingston 4800 took the lead on the average frames per second by 42.69%, on the min FPS by 47.23 frames per second, and on the max by 30.79%. That's pretty big. Sabrent just fell flat on this one. But on the flip side, the Sabrent 6000 took the lead all across the board here, coming in at max FPS 25.47. That's a 2.98% improvement over the Kingston 5600, coming in at 24.95 frames per second. And then on the min frames per second, 119.02 over 107.97 increase in favor of the Sabrent 6000. And then on average frames per second, the Sabrent came in at 196.30 over 189.62 on the Kingston 5600, a 3.40% improvement here. So Sabrent wins on this one again. Now on Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with no RTX, we can see here the Sabrent 4800 on max FPS takes the lead by 248.20 221 over 243.14 on the Kingston 4800. A 2.04% increase on speed here, again in favor of Sabrent. On min FPS, we can see the Kingston 4800 comes ahead by 101.22 over 100.23, 0.99% improvement on the Kingston side. And then on the average frames per second side, we can see the Sabrent 4800 takes the lead at 188.25 over 182.26, a 3.18% improvement on speed here. Now overall, we can see here the Sabrent 6000 again takes the lead at 251.98 frames per second over Kingston's 5200, 243.90 by 3.21%. And then on min FPS, we can see Sabrent 6000 again takes the lead at 127.66 over Kingston's 5200 at 14.14%. Kingston coming in at 109.61 frames per second. Then on average, we can see the Sabrent 6000 takes the lead at 199.87 over Kingston's 5200 at 183.55, an 8.17% increase in speed on the Sabrent side. Then it's still really interesting to see on all of these how the 6000 takes the lead, but if you look at the 4800, it still takes the lead on many of these, even though there is a 52 and a 56 here. Not all of them, but still, I'm going by everything I've been able to find. You may find differently, but again, I'm providing all the clocks, the cache latencies and everything so that you can try on your very own system and see what you can do with this memory. So coming into F1, the way I test for F1 2021, come into game options here, come into settings and graphic settings and video mode. So first off, I either test in 1920 by 1080 or 3840 by 2160. Then I either test under NVIDIA DLSS or TAA only. When I test in TAA only, I test with ultra high presets. Then I disable this and this so that there is no RTX. When I test with DLSS, I set this again to ultra high, and then I set this to ultra high, and then I make sure that ray trace shadows and trace reflections are on. And then of course, I always test under Bahrain, and then I just run the test here. At 1080p non-RTX, on the 4800 series, we can see the Kingston just falls flat. They tried, but they fell flat. To the Sabrent's 4800, on the maximum FPS, we can see the Sabrent comes in at 428 frames per second over the Kingston 4800's 419, a 2.10% improvement on speed here on the Sabrent side. Then the Sabrent takes 379 frames per second over the Kingston's 369 frames per second, a 2.64% increase on speed on the Sabrent side. And then on minimum FPS, the Sabrent comes in at 309 frames per second over 288 frames per second on the Kingston's, a 6.80% increase on speed on the Sabrent side. Overall, we can see here again, the 6000 takes the lead across the board, coming in at 435 frames per second on maximum FPS over Kingston's 5600 at 434 frames per second, a 0.23% increase in speed, 394 frames per second on average over Sabrent's 5600 at 389 frames per second, a 1.27% increase in favor of Sabrent. And then on the minimum frames per second, 327 over 321, a 1.83% increase on the Sabrent side. Now on F1 2021 at 1080p RTX Ultra, we can see the 4800 minimum FPS comes in at 313 over Kingston's 304 FPS, a 2.87% speed increase on the Sabrent side. Then on average, 378 frames per second over Kingston's 375 frames per second, a measly 0.79% increase on speed on the Kingston side. But then on maximum FPS, Sabrent falls flat, coming in at 421 frames per second under Kingston's 4800, coming in at 424 frames per second. Kingston bests Sabrent here by 0.71%. Overall, we can see yet again the Sabrent 6000 series at maximum 435 frames per second over Kingston's 5600, 433 frames per second, a 0.46% improvement. Then on average, 394 over 391, a 0.76% increase on the average score in favor of Sabrent. And finally, on minimum, the Sabrent comes in at 327 frames per second over Kingston 324 frames per second, a 1.53% increase on speed on the Sabrent side. So again, Asus's AEMP profile on the Sabrent 4800 takes the cake here. Asus really helps the Sabrent take the lead on this. Now, unfortunately, I don't have another DDR5 board to test the differences here, but we can see just how close the 4800 is to the 5600, the 5200, and in many cases, the 4800. So on to F1 2021 at 4K non-RTX, we can see the Kingston just fell flat over on the 4800 side over the Sabrent 4800. We can see on the minimum side, the Sabrent came in at 353 frames per second, while the Kingston came in at 232 frames per second, a 34.25% increase on speed on the Sabrent side. Now on the average side, we can see 311 frames per second over Kingston's 4800 at 195 frames per second, a 37.30% increase on speed here in favor of Sabrent. And lastly, on the minimum side, we can see the Sabrent came in at 257 frames per second over Kingston's 176 frames per second, a 31.52% increase in speed here. So again, the Sabrent 4800, the JDEC standard profile, bests Kingston's profile again on the 4800. Now it starts to get a little confusing here on this one because the 4800 took the cake in general on this. So coming back, comparing to the next highest, which is the Kingston 5600 over the 4800, the 6000 kind of got knocked down a few pegs here. The Sabrent 4800, again on max, came in at 353 frames per second, while the Kingston 5600 came in at 351 frames per second. Then on the average side, the Sabrent 4800 came in at 311 frames per second, under Kingston's 5600 at 313 frames per second, a 0.64% improvement in speed here in favor of Kingston. 4800 versus 5600. Kind of odd, but the 4800 does have tighter timings than the 5600, so not incredibly odd. And then coming in at the minimum frames per second, we can see the Sabrent 4800 came in at 257 frames per second, while the next highest, the Kingston 5200, came in at 258 frames per second. So a 0.39% increase on the Kingston side, but this time on the 5200. And that did have a higher cache latency of 40 over 32. So moving on to F1 2021 at 4K with RTX on, we can see at the 4800, again, the Kingston 4800 takes a nosedive. So at 249 frames per second versus 245 frames per second on the maximum FPS, takes the lead by 1.61%. On the average frames per second, for the Sabrent 4800 comes in at 231 frames per second over the Kingston 4800 by 227 frames per second, a 1.73% increase in favor on Sabrent. And then on the min FPS, we can see the Sabrent again takes the lead at 192 frames per second over 187 frames per second, a 2.60% lead in favor of Sabrent. Now taking the cake again is the Sabrent 6000. We can see the 6000 on the maximum FPS comes in at 263 over Kingston's next up, the 5200, at 255 frames per second. Here we can see a 3.04% increase on speed in favor of the Sabrent 6000. Then on the average frames per second, the Sabrent again comes in at 3.33% ahead of the Kingston at 240 frames per second over 232 frames per second. On the minimum side, the 6000 series comes in at 195 frames per second, while the 5200 comes in at 175 frames per second, a 10.26% increase on speed in favor of the Sabrent. So again, the Sabrent is taking the lead. But again, take a look at the 4800 comparing to the 56, the 52, and the 48 on the Kingston side. It still took the lead. So the tighter timings are really helping the Sabrent out on this. So let's jump into Far Cry 6. For Far Cry 6, I come under Options, Video. Then I set my monitor to 120 Hertz. I'm using a capture card now, which is stuck at 60 Hertz. That's why you see 60 there now. Then I'll change the resolution either to 1920 by 1080 or 3840 by 2160. And under Quality, I scroll all the way down. If I'm testing with DXR on, I leave this and this on. If I'm testing with it off, without RTX, I just come in here and turn those off, and then test in benchmark. Try to keep it simple. At 1080p Ultra with no RTX, we can see once again the Kingston 4800 took a nosedive with the Sabrent 4800 on minimum coming in at 119 frames per second over the Kingston's 105 frames per second, an 11.76% increase on speeds in favor of the Sabrent. On the maximum FPS, we can see the Sabrent 4800 came in at 197 over Kingston's 4800 at 180 frames per second, an 8.63% increase in favor of Sabrent. And finally, on the average FPS, the most important, 147 on the Sabrent 4800 versus 133 on the Kingston 4800, a 9.52% lead on the Sabrent 4800. Now overall, we can see once again the Sabrent 6000 takes the lead, 121 frames per second over Kingston's 5200 at 112 frames per second, a 7.44% lead in favor of Sabrent. On the maximum FPS, we can see the Sabrent takes the lead at 198 frames per second over Kingston's 5200 at 184 frames per second, a 9.09% lead in favor of Sabrent here again. And lastly, on the average FPS, we can see the 6000 comes in at 152 over Kingston's 5200 at 141 frames per second, a 7.24% lead again in favor of the Sabrent. Then again here, stepping back, we can see the 4800 taking the lead over the 5600, 5200, and 4800. So Sabrent really does have something nice with this 4800, and the latency, I think, is that reason. Now on Far Cry 6 at 4K with RTX on, we can see the Sabrent kind of takes a nosedive this time on this one. So at the minimum, Sabrent takes the lead at 95 frames per second over the Kingston 4800 at 93 frames per second, a 2.11% increase on the Sabrent side. But then on the max FPS side, we can see the Sabrent comes in at 123 frames per second under Kingston's 125 frames per second. So Kingston here takes the lead by 1.67%. On the average frames per second here, we can see again the Sabrent comes under Kingston's 106 frames per second, Sabrent at 105 frames per second. So we can see a 0.95% increase in favor of Kingston. Now coming in at the 6000, we can see again it takes the lead at 98 frames per second on minimum over the next highest Kingston 4800 at 93 frames per second, a 5.10% improvement on the Sabrent side. So coming in on the maximum FPS, we can see Sabrent comes in at 125, matching Kingston's own 4800 MHz RAM at 125 frames per second. That 125 frames per second is tied, but that's also the highest on the minimum FPS across the board on this one. Now, on average, the Sabrent came in at 107 frames per second over the next highest Kingston 4800 at 106 frames per second, a 0.93% increase on speed in favor on the Sabrent 6000. And again, that 6000 taking the lead, but this time the 4800 took a slight hit, coming in a little bit lower than the rest, but still relatively decent. So far here we can see with all the synthetics and the games so far, Sabrent is taking the lead with the 4800 taking the back seat here many times over the 5600 and the 5200 and Kingston's own 4800. So Sabrent really does have something nice here with that 4800. So let's go back to Far Cry. So now on Far Cry 6 at 4K Ultra non-RTX, we can see the Sabrent 4800 just decided to quit. So in this one, we can see the Kingston 4800 took the lead at 119 frames per second over Sabrent's 111 frames per second on minimum FPS. On maximum FPS, the 4800 Kingston took 145 frames per second over Sabrent's 142 frames per second, a 2.11% increase on speed in favor of Kingston. And then finally, on average, the Kingston 4800 came in at 129 frames per second, while the Sabrent came in at 126 frames per second, a 2.38% lead in favor of Kingston. Now, overall speed here, the Sabrent 6000 takes the lead here. Again, at minimum, 119 frames per second over Kingston's 4800 at also 119 frames per second. So 0% there, they're tied, but on Sabrent 6000 versus Kingston's 4800, that makes a very strong argument towards the Kingston 4800 there. So good job, Kingston. Then the 6000 series on Sabrent comes in at 146 frames per second over Kingston's 4800 at 145 frames per second. a 0.68% increase on speed in favor of Sabrent. On average, the 6000 came in at 132 frames per second over Kingston's 4800 at 129 frames per second, which also matches Kingston's 5200 at 129 frames per second, which is a 2.27% lead in favor of Sabrent. On HitMan 3, typically I either set it to 3840 by 2160 or I set it to 1920 by 1080. I turn off VSync for everything. Then I come under here. If I'm testing with DLSS, I have DLSS on, ultra performance, ray tracing on, ray trace sun shadows on, ray trace reflection on, and then everything set to ultra or as high as possible down here. I save over here and then I start the benchmark. Now if I'm not using DLSS, I come over here and I set to off and then I turn this off, which turns all of this off, and I leave all of this at ultra. And then I save and then I start benchmark. And that's how I test. Which is a little bit different because of the way the scores came out. I was able to fit a lot more on the screen, so work with me on this one. So here we can see at 6000, the Sabrent comes in and takes the cake. Again, 186.78 frames per second. That's 2.42% above Kingston's 5600 at 182.25 frames per second on 4K standard profile. At 1080p standard profile, the 6000 came in at 190.48 frames per second, 2.42% above Kingston's 5600 profile at 188.28 frames per second. At 1080p Ultra RTX, the Sabrent again takes the lead at 104.70 frames per second, 1.67% above Kingston's 5600, coming in at 102.95 frames per second. Now stepping down to the 4800 series, I kind of reversed that one as well. Comparing 48 to 48, we can see the Sabrent 4800 fell flat at 173 frames per second versus Kingston's 4800 MHz RAM at 175.14 frames per second, 0.73% faster on the Kingston side. Now at 4K Ultra RTX, we can see the 4800 takes the lead here at 84.68 frames per second over Kingston's 84.58 frames per second, a 0.19% increase on the Sabrent side. At 1080p, the standard profile, we can see the Kingston 4800 takes the lead at 176.95, a 0.73% lead over Sabrent's 174.05 frames per second. And then again, Sabrent takes the lead at 1080p Ultra RTX, 101.72 frames per second over Kingston's 100.22 frames per second, a 1.74% increase on the Sabrent side. Now stepping out of gaming now to some video editing, the program I use to do video editing is Wondershare Filmora. I've been using it since version 7, I think. I'm on version 11 now. 12 is coming out any day now, but we can see here the Kingston 5600 series comes in at 5 minutes 14 seconds and 787 seconds, the best speed in the test here, coming in at 1.34 seconds slower than Sabrent's 4800 at a 32 cast latency. So Sabrent came in at 5 minutes 16 seconds and 129 milliseconds. Not a huge difference, but it all adds up. So right now the Kingston 5600 takes the lead here. Now on the incredibly odd side, where you think maybe it would be third, but no, it is dead last. The Sabrent 6000 megahertz comes in at 5 minutes 21 seconds and 0.067 milliseconds. Comes in dead last, the Sabrent 6000 megahertz. That is a little bit odd considering it's come ahead just on everything else. On the Sabrent 6000 series, you have the advantage of more megahertz, but more megahertz isn't always better. A lot of times it's the latency. But the latency here is actually lower than most of the other ones, and still it came in on last. So Asus unfortunately couldn't save that one. Now it's incredibly odd because I actually reached out to Sabrent on the AEMP and they've never heard of it. My contact at Sabrent didn't know about this. Now it doesn't mean that the whole entire company doesn't know about this, but the fact that Sabrent doesn't know about this tells me that this is something Asus took upon themselves to do. So they can do the same for Sabrent, they can do the same for Kingston, they can do the same for Thermaltake, anybody. It's pretty awesome that Asus does that. They feel confident enough. Now the only thing is, just make sure, like always, that you're on the very latest BIOS to take advantage of any updates on the XMP profiles and any updates on on the AEMP profiles because maybe there could be an issue on that profile that Asus made and they don't know until further testing. So always stay up to date on the BIOS, at least read the release notes on BIOS updates, as the case in DDR5. When DDR5 came out, it got a bad rap because there were so many errors. If you have a DDR5 board, look at the BIOS version you're on now, then compare it with the other BIOS versions in between that version and the latest version to see all the improvements on RAM, system performance, system compatibilities, and different things there, and see if it makes sense. Hey, you've been blue screening a lot, or if you haven't, you've been working great, maybe stay away for a little while. So the Sabrent Rocket 32 gig kit comes in at about $200 on Amazon at the time of this review, and the Kingston Fury Beast memory comes in at about $230. Again, at the time of this review on Amazon. You can check in the links in the description below for my Amazon affiliate links. Pros and cons for this memory: this has a real heat shield and RGB as well, whereas this has a sticker that acts as a heat shield and no RGB lighting on it. This only has the JDEC standard profile, whereas the Kingston Fury Beast memory has 3 XMP profiles: 4800, 5200, and 5600. So that's another benefit here as well. But profiles aside, you saw the differences here. Many times the Sabrent would best Kingston Fury Beast. So take your pick on that one. Do you prefer the RGB flare with the real heatsinks, or do you not mind no RGB and sticker heatsinks? So definitely something to think about. Let me know what you think about this review in total down below. What do you think? Do you like it? Do you hate it? I took a different approach on the benchmarking side. Anyway, this is my review of the Sabrent Rocket and the Kingston Beast Fury 32 gig kits. Iggy with ThisBytesForYou out. See you guys.